of the Philistines' army to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. For those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Excuse me. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead was strewn along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." Yep, so that's the chapter. And we have just encountered David in action. Now, we always knew that David, or rather we learned from the last chapter that he was a shepherd, and most of us have probably heard about it in church, preached about how David was a shepherd. And David was a shepherd before he was ever a warrior and before he was king. But in his shepherding, he fought off bears and lions, and he describes that to Saul in the chapter. And when he was fighting the bears and the lions, he managed to translate the victory he had. As he's presenting his case to Saul, he says, "Just like the Lord rescued me from the bear and the lion, the same God will rescue me from the hand of the Philistines." There's a term for that in HR. It's like you are able to see the transferable skills that you have. And David has no doubt that it is God who rescued him from the lion and from the bear. And he says in verse 34, "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth." Look at that. We see David here able to equate the lion and the bear to this Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine who dares to defy, he says, to disgrace and defy the armies of the living God. Look at the level of honor that he gave the Israelite armies. David was a true patriot, and he believed in God, and he believed that the armies were not just armies of Israel, but he says the armies of the living God. His interpretation of the physical army was that it belonged to God, and the Philistine daring to challenge that army Well, they needed to be taught a lesson. And he says, "The Lord who rescued me from the power of the lion and the power of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine, will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." It's funny, he doesn't say, "will help me to fight." No, it's a rescue. Rescue in the mind of David meant utterly destroying the attacker. It wasn't just, "oh, I got away, thank God." No, it was annihilation of the enemy. That was a rescue. It was a complete job that included killing the opponent. And so we see that David's battle plan wasn't, "let's try and strike the enemy and then run away in front of him and hope he doesn't chase us." He was there to completely destroy, kill, annihilate and the enemy. That was his understanding. And the Lord was going to help him do it. So he had the backing of God and experience from the wilderness, taking care of the sheep. And so with that kind of mindset, he approaches the battlefield. And he goes there, sent on an errand by his own father, to do what? To check on his brothers. His daddy didn't send him out to fight. He sent him out to take care, as a good youngest son should do, take care of his oldest brothers. That was the convention, and it was expected that Jesse would want to know what was happening. His 3 sons were in the military, so it is no surprise that he wants to know how they're doing. There are 3 of them, and they're his eldest. So in this time, David is sent to find out and to send, and he also sends. We see that Jesse is very liberal with gifts. He wants to make the gift make way for him, and we saw that in chapter 16 when he sent David on with a gift to Saul. But also in this time, we realize that chapter 17, which is what we're currently on, is sort of ahead of the last bit of chapter 16, where we see David entering into the service of Saul. Because it's not likely, or is it, that Saul already knew David? Or maybe he used to play the harp before and then forgot about it. Well, anyway, Jesse sent on gifts even to the commanders of the army. He sent gifts. He was a generous man. And he made those gifts make way for him, for the favor that he got, which was information in this case. And he made a name for himself and his sons. He wanted the commanders to also treat his sons well. And what a better way than to send a gift with the youngest son. But this youngest son was not just a messenger. On this appointed day, he was going to do more than just deliver the goods. And we see where his focus was, because when David comes into the scene, he leaves his staff over with the caretaker. What is the name of this guy? He left the flock in the care of the shepherd. Now that's the first thing we see, that David wasn't irresponsible. He made sure that whatever he was supposed to have been doing that day got done while he got, to check on his brothers in the camp, in the battlefield. And then he loads up and sent out as Jesse had directed. That's in verse 20. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left the things with the keeper of the supplies. He didn't dump them somewhere. He was careful to leave them with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. Now, as he's talking with him, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, and we read the attributes of this man. He was huge. His armor alone was 58 kilograms, and just one little component of his spear was 7 kilograms, the tip of it. And he had this Philistine shouting his usual defiance. And whenever the Israelites saw him, they all fled from him in great fear. They looked at his stature, and that alone intimidated them. Now the Israelites had been saying that this man who destroys Goliath, the king will give great wealth to the man, and will also give him his daughter in marriage, and will exempt his family from taxes. And for some reason, David was really curious about that. He kept asking them, what will be done? In verse 26, what will be done for the man who kills it? And of course, it was the same thing. The great wealth, he'll be given the daughter in marriage, and will be exempt from taxes. Now, these perks may have seemed really attractive to David because he asks twice, what will be done? What is the reward? And it seemed like a worthy reward to him. And Eliab overhears him asking, and Eliab is the firstborn. He is the commander. He's the one who's in charge of his brothers. He's the eldest. And he asks, what have you come here to do? Who have you left the few sheep with? And he tells him something interesting, which probably says something about David. He says, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. Really, you came down only to watch the battle. But of course, David had no intention to just watch the battle. He came for action. And you can see that by how he portrays himself and how he carries himself. He wasn't wicked of heart either, because we see how he addresses Saul. When he comes before Saul, he tells him, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And that's a valiant man. A man who is going to honor his word, a man of his word, because he goes straight ahead to do that. So Eliab, in his jealousy or whatever it was that intimidated him about David, really, we're not told, but it seems that they had a very strange relationship here. And they, at that moment of crisis and pressure, he was losing his mind, and I guess something ticked him off. Anything could tick anybody off during war. And seeing his little brother asking questions among the camp and all, I don't know, maybe it sparked something in him that wanted to just get him out of there, because he was probably thinking this is serious business, and this little boy, you know, he was the youngest, so maybe they saw him as just a shepherd. But David knew what he had overcome, and he borrowed from this experience. And borrowing from verse 30, it says, he turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And when the men answered him as before, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So he wanted to know what the reward was. And he also had a mindset that is introduced to us in verse 26. He said to the man standing near him, what will be done to the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? And that was reported to Saul, and he asked for David. And David came in front of him, and he said, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And of course, when the lion and the bear came, the Lord rescued him. And that same God, the Lord who rescued me from the power of the lion and the power of the bear, will rescue me. And so Saul gave him the armor and said, okay, go ahead, try your luck, see how it goes. And after fastening the things on the armor and all, he couldn't use them. And he was honest enough to say, I cannot go in this because I am not used to them. He was honest about it. He didn't try to go to battle with things he wasn't used to wearing because he was bent on victory and he didn't want anything to hinder him. He had already fixed his eye on destroying Goliath. And he said that to the king. He said, I, your servant, will go and fight him. And he's going to go fight him to destroy him. So, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and he saw that he was just a boy. Of course, he's wondering, how dare these people match me up with a boy who's coming in front of me with a sling? A sling? And he said, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds. And David says, oh, you come against me with a sword and a spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. Now, according to David, this Philistine had no respect for not just the army or its leader, but he had disrespected the Lord himself. He had no respect to the Lord Almighty. And we see what the Philistine kept saying, Goliath, that is. For 40 days he came forward, saying, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. He kept saying that for 40 days, and none of them had the guts to go ahead in front of the Philistines and fight Goliath. They were all petrified. And if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and servers. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. So David fights Goliath, and we know that he did it with a sling and no armor. And even before Goliath could pick up his bearings, he had already gone ahead and uttered these words. First of all, affirming that the Lord was going to defeat the Philistine. Why? Because Goliath was defying God himself. I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, David says. This day, in verse 46, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. That's what he tells the Philistine. I will cut off your head. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Look at that. He knows the effect that will have on the whole world. David wasn't playing small. His league was not just his family and the sheep. He wanted the whole world to know that there is a God, that there was a God in Israel. Are you so zealous? Are you zealous about the world knowing that there is a God? Look at that. David had set his sights on a very high goal that even his family didn't know about. That the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered will all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands, not by might and not by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. It wasn't by spear or sword. Remember, he tells the Philistine Goliath, you come to me with the sword. He had, we place so much value in these things, the ammunition and the weapons and the machinery, and that's exactly what David is saying. You have come to me with your sword and your javelin and your things. But what makes those things work It is the Lord who saves using those things. But the spear is only a spear in the hand of a man who trusts in the Lord. And he says, it is the Lord that saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into my hands. And that is into our hands, the Israelites' hands. So as the Philistine moved closer to attack David, David reaches into his bag, running quickly towards the battle line to meet him. And all this while he's taking a stone out of his bag, he slings it while running and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. He changed tactic. He knew he didn't have to use a sword. He had never used a sword, probably. And now he was using a sling the same way he knew how to use it on this occasion, regardless of what was conventional and what was expected. David ran and stood over him, and he took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. Note that David fell. He felled that Philistine with the sling. And then now here he draws the Philistine's sword from the sheath after he killed him. So he used a sword to kill him. He cut off his head with a sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Of course, the effect was, our man, our hero, has gone, so we are doomed, he's dead. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead was strewn along Sharaim and to Gath and to Ekron. From Gath along the Sharaim road to Gath and Ekron, all along the road. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered it. And David took the Philistine's head, brought it to Jerusalem, and now Saul is interested. He is intrigued. His curiosity has been triggered, and he's wondering, who is this? And Abner has no idea who the boy is, or who the man is, or the young man is. And Abner replies, as surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know who this is. And David and the king said, find out whose son it is. And Abner, instead of finding out, just brings David over to Saul and tells him, and Saul asks, young man, whose son are you? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. And so Saul gets to see what David is about in action, but also gets to finally meet him as a warrior, as the champion of his armies, as the champion who saves the armies of the Lord. Now, the armies themselves didn't seem to remember that they belonged to the Lord. The soldiers did not seem to remember. Even Saul himself did not seem to remember that his army belonged to the Lord. It's only David who seems to remember that, and to call the armies of Israel the Lord's army, because he recognized that the army was led by the Lord. So even the members of the army themselves forgot all about God leading them in battle. So David, because of who he trusted in, and because he has worked a skill of the battle, of winning the battle with bears and lions, and he has honed this army tactics, battle tactics, and he has mastered strategy. He knows how to approach each scenario differently. He knows what works for this, what doesn't work. But he also recognizes that it is the Lord who gives him the wisdom for know-how. And because it's the Lord's armies, he will defeat the enemy, and he will defend and rescue his soldier who stands out in faith. So it wasn't really about David's strength. It was about God backing him up every step of the way. So he, in the end, wins the battle for Saul and his men, and Saul wants to meet him. And all along, he had been sent as a messenger to deliver some supplies and find out how his brothers were doing. Change of mission. Could you be in the middle of being repurposed? Whatever they thought they sent you out for possibly isn't what you're there for. Could you imagine that God has a bigger plan for what you think is a small role, and your day of standing out as the winner, as the warrior, as the savior is coming because you trust in the Lord? Yeah, because you trust in the Lord. And then now the kings will want to know you. Who are you? Tell them that you're the son or the daughter of the living God who still lives today. And when the battle is hot, invoke the name of the Lord, because you have relationship, because he's your father anyway. It is the Lord who gives victory. Victory belongs to the Lord, and the battle belongs to him. So he will fight it for you, but he will also give you the wisdom, he will give you the courage, he will give you the ideas, and he's been preparing you, perhaps all this time, for just a day like this, as we see for David. Just this one day changed the course of his life forever and ushered him once again into the courts of his future palace and into his divine mandate. Maybe it takes just one war, one crisis like this, one occasion that opens the door of opportunity for you. Are you ready? Are you ready for your opportunity? So we continue next with chapter 18. See you soon.